It's why it's so important to have the person, right? Like my mother-in-law and I were going through some things. I have an ancestry.com account and I try to keep all of this stuff together for the kids. And I found my father-in-law's headstone, right? And I was like, oh, I he died when my husband was 5. We're separated. And I was like, hey, I'm gonna send you this. Send it to Mark, because he's not talking to me. Like, send it to Mark. I think that he would like to see it. I'm gonna bring the kids, this and the other thing. And it set us off into like this 2-hour conversation just about family stories. Good morning, Amy. And that history is important too. And colonization takes that history from us, right? Like, why are you not so important? Why are your family stories not historical? Right? That worship of the written word says your tiny little story does not matter. But the story that they want to weave about the founding of this country, or, I've shared on my Black History series. Yeah, I'm like, look at how this man was written. That story was important for them to preserve in a certain way. But now, if I were to tell that story, it would be completely different, right? Because I'm going to tell you the violence that he brought against Black bodies that very well could have been my own kin, my own relation. This is another reason why stories are important and amplify marginalized voices, because who's telling the story? Who got to write these books? Who is telling the story of history? It's not just white men, it's very specific sect of white men that are telling this story, right? So they're not even telling the story of the poor white man. They're not telling the story of the poor white woman, the disabled one, the queer one. They're giving a very, very intentional elite story of white nationalism and white elitism that does not even cover all of white people. So if you're left out of your own history, imagine where that leaves us who are more marginalized than you when it comes to race. So all of those things are worthy of unpacking, right? So I said, storytelling passes down knowledge, values, and lessons from previous generations, preserving the wisdom that informs present day liberation efforts. You will see that through my Black History series that I have been sharing. Like, this is not new for us. You need some Black history through a lens of liberation and not through the lens of white history, which is like civil rights and enslavement. And it's like, that's not our history. That's white history disrupting Black history. Let me show you what Black history looks like while surviving the violence of whiteness. Completely different story then, right? I put as an example, an elder shares stories of resistance and survival during a community gathering, connecting younger generations to their history. That is important, right? Years ago, and I try to remember these things, but years ago I was on a podcast. My friend Danny um, offered me a spot on her podcast and was like, I want to interview you. I want to get to know some things. And we were talking about origin stories. My origin story, for me, my mom's Irish, first generation American. So my origin story was completely different than other, Black Americans that are experiencing this place, right? Um, and so when I learned about being Black, right, because that wasn't going on as much in my home, I was Black as a matter of fact, but not the way I am intentionally Black with my children, learning this history, knowing their stories. When I learned Blackness, it was through the lens of white history. And I was like, this is terrible. This is a terrible story. Like, this is absolutely horrible. Which was completely different than where my mom was able to pour into me, right? Like the origin story of being Irish and a rebel and like fuck the Brits and like we're never gonna go down in colonization was totally not the same story that I received of my Black ancestors. And I'm like, wow, this is a horrible origin story. And this is my unpacking process. And I'm like, so like, if this is the origin story that we've been getting as Black people in America for generations, how does that impact how you show up? How does that impact our own internalized anti-Blackness? How does that impact how we feel about other Black people? Like, it just was a whole other rabbit hole for me to go under or go into, because that's not our history. That's their history. But when it is given to us as our own history, it's a very victimy, be shamed of it. Like you were conquered. Like, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, no, actually we weren't. This is why we're fighting so hard for, our culture to be preserved, to be respected, to be honored like anybody else would want to. So those things are super important when you're listening to the elders tell you the stories of what it's not that long ago. It's just not that long ago. What they went through, their survival, how to do these things. The blueprint has been there, right? It changes things completely. And it does connect. Like our kids do not turn around and they don't feel so far removed from these generations. They recognize that you are a continuation of these amazing people. Michelle says, ooh, we are all chasing this millionaire fairy tale instead of celebrating our own rich stories. Yeah. Like, yes, exactly that, right? Like my family history is important to me, right? Like for many reasons, right? Like this is I'm living my own history, right? Like I share about my mom passing, that's legacy, right? No, our name may never go down in the history books like the Rockefellers, but it's legacy for me. It's legacy for me to pass down to my children. It's my history. What I'm doing right now is important for my children to know, right? Like, and this is our family history. And what did their grandmother do? And what did she do? And what did he do? And they do, and we do. Your individual stories matter. Your individual families matter. And then the more we get into that, the more we'll see how we share similar stories. We share similar spaces, right? You can't turn around. I was watching, it's crazy. Decolonization is wild because, like, you just like can't unsee it anymore, right? I don't know what show I was watching. I am like a like DIY flip this house sort of, but it's one of those. And they were like upstate New York, New England somewhere. And it was like, this house was founded in 18 whatever the hell. And all I was thinking about is it was built there, this kind of thing. And I'm like, but where were the indigenous people? Like things that I would have never thought about in my 20s, right? Like it just didn't dawn on me, right? Like you just kind of hear, well, they had reservation. Like you just don't think about it because the way history and stories have been given to us. And now when I see something like a town established, I'm like, you mean stolen? Like you literally eliminated as many people as possible so that you could steal this place, rename it something, right? Like Charlottesville or Charlotte, North Carolina is named after Queen Charlotte because she was the queen at the time of the 13 colonies here before America gained its independence. But what happened to all those other people? What was it before that, right? Thinking about all of those things and those stories matter. They matter and they intersect with other stories. So I personally love to hear people's stories because that's who we are, right? And if we don't have our stories, then we have to go with the stories that they give us, right? It's where you get those fucking white people. I'm like, you're poor. What is happening, right? I'm so confused at why you are caping for